All right. So when designing weekly templates for athletes, as in what should they be doing on Monday? What should they be doing on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday? Something that comes up regularly is how much training should athletes do on specific things in order to progress them versus just maintain them, right? So within the sport of CrossFit, athletes need to be good at a lot of different stuff. They need to be able to do thrusters and pull-ups. They need to be able to do heavy squat cleans at the end of a workout when they're tired. And to support all that stuff, there's also all the kind of like accessory general preparation stuff that needs to be done as well. So, that includes things like rowing intervals, running intervals, just getting strong enough and squatting, doing some Turkish get ups and band pull aparts. And a lot of coaches and athletes sort of understand like, cool, there's all this stuff that I can be doing. I want to do all of it. Some folks are kind of blessed with the training volume tolerance and the time and the sponsorship to be able to just work out all day. And some of those people maybe kind of can do anything and everything every single week. But for most people, you're going to have to start to prioritize, right? You're going to have to say, okay, this is the important thing right now. This is what we're focusing on. We're going to put some of this stuff on maintenance. So maybe just do it intermittently, and honestly right now we're just going to do none of this type of training. And so I think that figuring out how to balance that across a week is very challenging for athletes and coaches. And just understanding like, okay, it's okay to let this slip a little bit versus we can touch on this roughly this amount to maintain it versus you need to get stronger and we need to see you, squatting this number of times, per week, deadlifting this number of times per week, even doing some cleans this number of times per week, and just figuring out like, how do we actually lay that out across the week, I think is pretty tough. So Luke, what do you think about when you're trying to write a weekly template for an athlete in terms of how often they need to be working on their priorities versus how often they need to be working on things that they're just maintaining?
So I suppose one way of looking at it, and I've sort of discussed this previously, is just sort of trying to bucket things into something that's high intensity compared to something that's low intensity. And sort of, if you're looking at starting a training week on a Monday, you work your high intensity stuff on the Monday, on the Wednesday, also on the Friday. On the Tuesday, you would do lower intensity stuff. On the Thursday, potentially rest. Or work even lower intensity, sort of similar to active recovery or aerobic base type work, and then figure out where the priorities are and try to align them on those days. So generally I will have people doing some form of more, you could say, heavier type training, faster, more taxing to the nervous system type training on like a Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And if they have priorities that are within those areas, it will tend to go on those days. The sort of idea behind that is just making sure that they're able to do that type of work the day after a rest day or potentially the day before a rest day. But that's probably, quite specific there. I would say zooming out, if we look at the Open or the training leading up to the Open, you could say that training at that stage is putting the most amount of things on some form of maintenance. You're not really trying to progress certain skills, movements, capacities, other than just getting people really, really sharp and able to handle, a whole host of different movements in a whole host of different environments, and do so and try to maximize on their results. So in that scenario, you could say that you're looking to have a touch on every movement that comes up in the Open, let's say every 2 weeks, or some form of movement pattern or something like that, or some form of say skill or style of test every couple of weeks. And then say, for example, if you have an individual who really struggles with more sort of heavier battery style work, you could be like, okay, we're going to do that on the Monday, so we're just doing that on the day that you're going to be the freshest. So I would say that in that period of training, you're probably looking at the most amount of variance within what you do, and you're probably doing a couple of things for, say, prehab and just keeping people healthy. And then as people move further away from competition, so we're sort of going backwards now from the Open, as they start getting, say, 6 months away from the Open, you're probably going to find that you're taking more things out and you're working on your priorities a little bit more often, and you're probably doing so in a little bit more of a, say, sport specific type environment, and then zooming out to the point where people are literally just finished competition, they're going into their off season. You're then really trying to take care of people's priorities that are going to be based more around like limitations in their physiology, limitations in their movement, the stuff that just takes quite a while to develop, and you're probably not going to be focusing on the stuff that is going to be more sport specific. I had a point that I've completely forgotten. It will come back, but someone help me out here.
Well, something I'm curious about, I mean, I think that that's a pretty good framework for deciding how often to work on stuff. But something that I am curious about is how you communicate that to athletes, right? Where it's like, hey, this is the priority right now. We're leading into the Open, so we need to do this, or it's off season for you, so we need to do that. And, I think the two things that probably most of us see from athletes is that they really get concerned if they're not doing enough strength work, right? Where they're like, I need to get stronger. I should be squatting more. Why isn't my snatch going up? And then the other thing is just the high intensity conditioning, right? Where they can get really antsy if they feel like they're not getting their ass kicked enough by workouts. And so I'm curious how you communicate to folks, say those aren't priorities. Okay, here's what we're working on. You're not squatting as much. You're not getting your ass kicked by conditioning as much. Here's why. And it's going to be okay.
I mean, I suppose a lot of it comes back to sort of the ongoing conversations that you're having with your athletes. I try to get conversations at sort of several points of the year, at least. Most of my athletes I'm talking to fairly regularly, and we're discussing the sort of general plan of action as we go along. I try to at least have a bit of a conversation for at least 5 minutes within every chat, just sort of going over bigger picture type stuff. And I think what I find interesting actually sometimes is that people tend to have their sort of anxieties around training tend to crop up at like the wrong time, if that makes sense. So in the off season, they're wanting to do as much CrossFit as they can because they've just got their ass kicked in the Open, and then sort of towards the end of, say, the strength building period of the year, they're not happy with the strength gains that they got. So then they're like, well, I still need to keep working on this, going into the Open. And it's like, no, you should not be trying to do 5 rep maxes and, a bunch of back offsets and all this type of stuff at that sort of phase of the training year. My point did actually come back to me. So I think generally when you're looking at maintaining things and letting things slip, I think just sort of a general rule of thumb is, if it's going to take some form of sort of prioritized work, or if it's going to take a considerable effort to bring something back up, then you've probably let go of it a little bit too much. So you still want to sort of keep some touches of certain things going on all the time, to the point where it doesn't drop off too much. So let's just say someone really, just generally struggles with heavy sandbag cleans or sort of odd object style. Let's say that they don't struggle with it. And you're like, okay, well, we're going to focus a lot more on your gymnastics. And you end up going through training, which takes you down the rabbit hole of gymnastics, and it takes you some prioritized work, and actually maybe longer than, say, 3 weeks of just general exposure to get used to sort of awkward odd object hinging type actions. If it takes you more than that, then you probably want to make sure that next time you don't not include it enough so that you can keep that going. So if you are having to take some considerable action to get something back up, then I think that's probably where you sort of let go of things a little bit too much. And I suppose now, if there's anything that sort of come from high level sort of CrossFitters and the programming that we see, and the sort of the programming that we see to be successful, it's that this real very traditional idea of like accumulation, intensification, and all this type of stuff. It doesn't necessarily have to be as clear cut as that. There does need to be some element of that, but we're sort of seeing that the interference of training different things doesn't necessarily occur to the point that, you know, we may have believed, say, 5-6 years ago.
I think one thing that's worth keeping in mind as well is the different time it takes to bring things back up or to develop things. So, you know, taking something like strength, that's a longer term development. And to make significant strength improvements takes a long time. You look at kind of the higher intensity end of CrossFit, where it's more of the open style workouts or competition style workouts. That higher end conditioning, that higher level ability to move fast and keep moving, I think comes around a little bit quicker if you have a good aerobic base. So quite often for athletes, I'm looking at, okay, in out of competition season. So for athletes coming in now who've just, you know, they've gone through the open, they've gone through quarterfinals, and that's kind of the end of their season for CrossFit. Right now, the focus is going to be moving back towards that strength accumulation, aerobic development kind of timing, because they don't need to maintain high intensity, and that conditioning comes a little bit easier closer to competition time. And if they want to do kind of mid-season competitions, whether it's online qualifiers or in-person ones, that kind of thing is a little easier to ramp up over the course of 4 weeks than anything else in their program.
Yeah, I think that there's also individual variation in terms of how easy it is to bring things back up, right? I think that probably everyone listening can think of their own kind of talent level, let's say, right? So I know for myself, when I was training more seriously, I didn't have to do anything to be good at deadlifting and power snatching, right? I could not train that at all, and I would still be pretty good at it. And if I wanted to get better at it, you know, just give me a few sessions of it, and it's like, okay, cool, it's back where it was, right? Handstand push-ups, on the other hand, extremely challenging for me, very difficult, always a struggle. You know, if I didn't do it for a while, it would fall off. So I think that that's something that you probably have an idea for yourself, and then potentially for athletes who you work with. You know, I can think of some higher level athletes who I've worked with in the past that really just could like kind of do CrossFit whenever. You know, they didn't need to be peaked for it. They didn't need to be in some sort of like intensification training phase. Like you said, Luke, it's just like, yeah, I can just sort of do this stuff whenever, and I'm going to be pretty good at it no matter what. But for them, it was actually a struggle to get better at that kind of stuff, right? Their baseline was always relatively high, but they had to do a lot of work to see improvement in doing like CrossFit, like open style testers. So that's an interesting dynamic where you're like, okay, you don't need to do much to maintain this. In fact, you can almost do nothing, right? You can just do like a general strength and conditioning program without any CrossFit in it and still probably beat most people on a CrossFit workout. But if you're already pretty good and you want to get better, you actually have to do CrossFit kind of all the time in order to try to improve that. So, you know, understanding someone's baseline versus their tendency to improve on different traits, I think can be another whatever lens to look at that concept with.
Yeah, I think it's something that it can be quite perplexing for coaches, where it's sort of, you know, generally I think coaches will probably start to draw upon their own experiences of how long things took for them individually. They're sort of using that information, and then the first sort of few people that are training, if say for instance they're working mainly with beginners and at the start, which most people do, then you have sort of this newbie gains type situation where it's like, okay, we'll just make you squat twice a week and that number's just going to go up. And there's plenty of protocols that you can do which are, you know, have a fairly you know, easy implementation into like a CrossFit program. And then as people do develop and as people's progress really sort of slows down, especially within those people who are competing at really high levels, it can be really quite difficult because, like you said, you know, you might have an individual who just really needs to take some focused time to actually improve on their CrossFit ability, but they're generally quite good at it. And then, you know, we have sort of a general understanding that the more you can do sport specific stuff, the sort of generally better. And the people that are able to handle the most CrossFit in their training, generally that's quite a positive thing. But if you have like a really good athlete who they can sort of do that, and then they actually need to do a lot more focused work and taking time away from doing CrossFit to improve on it, it can be quite difficult to you could say make that sort of distinction and actually get them to sort of take that time away, because generally speaking people are going to be like, well, I still want to have a good touch on the sport, and I don't seem to be dropping off in performance. I know for me personally, like, post opens, I was like, I don't want to go near CrossFit, and I really quite enjoyed just doing sort of the more off season style training, because I found it quite exhausting. But you do have those individuals where it's just like they can always just do a little bit of it and it gets better. But you have to figure out quite early on how the individual is going to adapt to things, and that's also something that progresses over time. So the athlete that you've been working with for 3 years isn't the same athlete that they were in the first 6 months that you're working with them. So you can't necessarily use that sort of those same assumptions and things like that when designing things.
Yeah, I think with something you mentioned before, Luke, just the idea of high and low training days, that's also an important concept to keep in mind here. And so, just for folks who may not be familiar with this terminology, the idea is essentially that you have some training sessions or days that one would consider like high nervous system demand, right? So heavy squatting, difficult intervals, CrossFit style training, etc. And then other days you have lower nervous system demand. So things that are more like accessory work, positional work, aerobic base building, something like an easy run for a marathon training program. And typically, I know for most of my folks who I'm writing training for, I tend to alternate high and low either training days or sessions. Right. So for some athletes who are doing AM, PM sessions, especially if they're more competitive, they may have the morning session as a high intensity session, the evening session as a low intensity session, and they kind of flip flop back and forth like that. Other folks, it's, Monday high, Tuesday low, Wednesday high, Thursday low, kind of laid out like that. And so one thing that's important to consider is what are we actually doing on our high intensity days versus what are we doing on our low intensity days? And so, the training priorities tend to be what we put on the high intensity days. And so that's not always going to be strength work, right? Sort of like we said before, some people, we want to just put strength on maintenance. And so for them, maybe we're doing double overhand deadlifts with no hook grip as their low intensity training day, because that's kind of like a self-limiting exercise that allows them to get some hard contractions in, maintains a little bit of hinging volume, but it's not a priority for them to get better at deadlifting. But maybe they really, really struggle at conditioning with gymnastics. So their high intensity days are a lot of rowing intervals going into chest to bar pull-ups, and then 21, 15, 9 ring push-up and ring dip, or some just like terrible muscle endurance combo or something like that, right? And so that might be a high intensity day for an athlete working on gymnastics, and their low intensity day is a lot of like quote unquote strength work, because they don't really need to work on it and they just need a few touches on it to kind of maintain that capacity. And so that might be another useful way to think about laying out an entire week, so you're not feeling like, oh my God, I just have to do everything all the time.
I think it's also
quite
worth
interesting
considering.
Go,
Luke.
Okay, thank you. You're so polite. I was going to say as well, like certain things tend to deliver a little bit more of an ass kicking for certain individuals, and other things as well. Like, I can remember sort of the idea that the sort of a heavy deadlift set or something like that, say like a heavy triple or something, was super fatiguing on the nervous system. And you have people like, my CNS is fried. and then like you get a message from a client, I think I got CNS fatigue, I got adrenal fatigue. It's like, no, you don't. But then, say 500 meter row repeats at like quite a high intensity, but still staying in sort of some like aerobic power zone, that could kick the shit out of someone, a lot harder than a heavy like deadlift triple. So people respond to things very, very differently, and I think that it's important also to take that into consideration. Like, I know that more endurance type stuff would take it out of me quite a lot, but if you said to me, okay, do Fran, it was like, okay, that's I wouldn't necessarily enjoy it, but it was like that necessarily didn't take out as much as me as say doing like a say 20-minute AMRAP or some accumulating a load of mixed modal work in like an hour's session. So sort of taking that individual feedback from the athlete as well and being like, does this really make you tired? And it's like, yes, that does. It's like, okay, we're going to put that in before a rest day so you can have a full day rest so you can recover properly from it. And that could be obviously very, very, very different for different people.
I think it's worth considering the like level of the athlete as well when it comes to this stuff. So if you look at like a games level athlete, their ability to pick up on stuff and to get back up to speed is going to be a lot different to a mid-level or to a kind of beginner competitor, as it were. And it's, you know, for those kind of games level athletes, they have their routine, they have everything kind of dialed in, they know what works for them and what doesn't. But their off season is going to look a lot different to others because they have relatively small number of weaknesses that they can focus on. So, you know, sure, everyone always wants to get stronger, and that's, I doubt there's many games athletes that don't focus on strength at any point of the season. But you know, there's some games athletes who are like, well, I don't need to focus on gymnastics. I can just keep it ticking over and it's always going to be there for me. And as long as I'm doing, you know, a couple of gymnastic metcons a week, that's going to be good come competition time. Whereas those mid-level athletes often have, you know, 2 or 3 major holes they need to fix, plus a bunch of things they need to get up to a little bit better level. And that's where that kind of balancing how much time you focus on different areas gets a little more difficult, I think.
Yeah, John, I think that your point there just about the adaptation speed for really high level athletes is very insightful, right? And I know that that's something that the first time you coach someone like that, you're like, oh, interesting. You just get better at everything you do very quickly, kind of no matter what. And, you know, I think that there's a lot of misconceptions, let's say, in the sort of like overall marketplace of ideas that people are like, oh, it's like this progression, or like it's, you know, Fraser's beta alanine, like that's the ticket, like that's the thing. But, you know, I've coached a lot of people. Some of them are very, very good. It's not like there was some special progression that they did. They just immediately got way better at everything all the time and didn't stop getting better. And you're like, that's cool. Like, good job. You know, so for those folks, the prioritization conversation becomes a little bit different because it's like, hey, I think you should probably get better at your muscle ups. Let's touch on muscle ups, you know, 2 times a week. And they're like, sounds good. And then they're just immediately better at it 4 weeks later. And you're like, yeah, I'm a good coach. Like, I'm the best coach there is. It's like, no, that person's just a freak. Like, you didn't really do anything that special other than like help them maybe focus and prioritize.
Did you see the morning chalk up email this morning?
Yeah.
About the beta alanine.
Yeah.
Did you see that, Luke?
John, enlighten us.
No.
It's
beta alanine just gives me an itchy face.
Blanc said that they sold more beta alanine last month than they did last year, based off the back of Matt Fraser's Joe Rogan podcast.
Oh, it gives me an extra lung.
Yeah.
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 It's the perfect tagline. Perfect tagline.
Yeah.
But I think just sort of circling back to the point you were making, John, about the different time it takes for people to develop, and obviously if you're going to have someone who's just sort of getting into the sport, they're going to be looking at things from like a year to year basis, or, you know, maybe they compete every 3 months, maybe they look at things on like an every 3 months basis or something like that. But more and more now, you're probably going to find that, let's take strength as an example. You have someone who is wanting to compete at the games. They're, say, early 20s, but they want to be getting there in a few years. Like, they may actually start to have to think a little bit more like an Olympic athlete, where they're making not necessarily a 4-year plan, but they're like, okay, I want to be at the sort of strength level I need to be at, and be able to express that in fatigue scenarios after a bunch of work and all this type of thing in a few years' time. And how does that look? That means, you know, maybe No, I think I listened to apparently Ed Cohen, who's the he's known as the GOAT in powerlifting. Apparently, he sort of very very early on that he just made this sort of he created his programs. And he's like, oh, if I make a £5 PR, every cycle or whatever it is, then I'm going to be world champion at this stage. And he's probably that individual who is obviously able to adapt to everything and just has a lot going for him in the sport, not taking anything away from his hard work. However, I do think that people now more so within the sport of CrossFit, you probably need to be looking at things over the course of a couple of years, because a lot of the conversations are always next year. What's going to be happening next year, and programming and everything is sort of very much driven by those conversations. Whereas if you actually looking to make a real push in the sport and you want to get to a really high level, it's probably going to take you a couple of years to be able to find that groove, especially if you're not that individual who just reacts really, really, really well and adapts really well to all sorts of training.
So in terms of summing this up, priorities are, something that we want to be training much more frequently, probably regularly hitting on them on the high intensity days, right? So that could be potentially 3 to 5 times a week for some athletes, depending on how it's structured. And that's also something that we can touch on the lower priority or maintenance days as well. And just in terms of lining stuff up, typically we want to have maybe 3 priorities per training cycle, and you just kind of slot things in based upon that. And then it's up to your intuition as a coach and understanding of an athlete to know, how much training does an athlete need to maintain something? How much training does an athlete need to have something get better? And then what kind of stuff, if we do let it drop off, sort of like you said, Luke, is going to require significant training to get it back, versus what stuff can we kind of let go? And then we know, what, if we touch on this again for 3 to 4 weeks, it's going to be right back where it was. And so hopefully that's helpful in terms of laying out a whole week of training for folks, since I know that can be a little bit tricky to try to figure out how am I going to slot all this stuff in? How am I going to slot in all the cool stuff that this athlete should be doing? Well, you can't do it. So you just got to make trade-offs and see what happens.